18, Journey of a Lifetime, Lesson 18, the book of Isaiah. Start with a couple of notes on Isaiah that are not in your book if you'd like to add them, or you can just put them in the back of your mind. Isaiah, we're going to about 700 BC. And if you don't know where that is, remember what I said when we look at we're starting the prophets, we look at the prophets over here on our shelf. These are our prophets, but the prophets lived in the time of the history. So Isaiah, if you want to find him in the books of history, this is where his life is mentioned in the history of the kings, in 2 Kings 19 and 20. So Isaiah lived there, and you'll see in the beginning of Isaiah, it talks about 4 kings that he was the prophet to that are mentioned there. And so those all lived in roughly this time period, but he's mentioned by name in that passage in 2 Kings, which means 700 BC, which was just before, you'll remember 722 is when Israel was conquered. We're going to talk about that later. And then finally, Judah was conquered in the 500s. And we'll look at the timeline in just a moment. All right, the first paragraph. Wait, sorry, I forgot to mention this too. So we're starting with the prophets. All the prophets have a general theme, almost all. There's a couple of exceptions, but this is the general message of all the prophets. A lot of them didn't have very unique message. This was the general message. They were preaching, some of them were, in early days, as we'll see, were preaching to kings specifically. Like Isaiah, he did talk to general people, but he also talked to kings. Elisha and Elijah primarily spoke to the individual kings, but then the later prophets would talk just to the people. They were sort of public preachers. Most of them were, and they all had this similar message. Remember in 2 Kings, that's when the country is falling apart, absolutely falling apart. It's been divided. People are about to be carried off. People are disobeying God. It's in chaos. There's a lot of corruption, as we'll see. And this was the message. They're talking to the people of Israel are breaking God's law and forsaking his ways, which usually involved a few things. Usually involved idolatry, bringing in foreign gods. It usually involved corruption in government. So you have the wealthy people oppressing the poor people, the two ways that came to be. And then, of course, they're also taking the religious laws that Moses had given and are corrupting them. As we see in the New Testament, the people that Jesus was just really the toughest on were the Pharisees. And what the Pharisees did, they were very religious people, but that used religion to oppress people. I would say those are the people that God hates the most, people that take his law and use his law and twist it to oppress other people. That's the people that Jesus called street dogs. He called them the blind leading the blind. He called them all kinds of unflattering things. People use God's law to oppress other people. So the message is, you're breaking God's law, you're walking away from God. And then there's a second part of the message. If you don't repent, God is going to send judgment or punishment. But there is always a happy ending in most of them, that when you, or a later generation, because sometimes it was not that generation, a later generation returns to God, he will restore you. And of course, in the latter prophets, that restoration wouldn't happen until the New Testament. It'll be hundreds of years later for some of the people. And so that is the general theme that you can sort of see that happening in all the prophets. As I said, there are a few exceptions. All right, so now as it says here, we finished the poetic books last week when we saw Proverbs and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, and today we're beginning all the prophetic books. And as it says here, they were written during the days of gloom when Israel had abandoned their religion. So you'll see this 700 BC. This is after the nation has divided. There's lots of infighting. And so this sort of decay has started. There are ups and downs, but it's a general trend of going away from God until finally at the end with Malachi, the final prophet, before the 400 years of silence, it's just there's no more prophets that are even sent. And we're going to look at all of those prophets as we go along. Now, first of all, of course, what is a prophet? You can see there the second paragraph on page 77. It says in Deuteronomy 18:55, Moses wrote that God would raise up prophets. So what is a prophet? Well, as you can see there, a prophet, you can divide it up in two things. We looked at that during the time of Proverbs. Remember, Proverbs, pro meant instead. And what did verbs mean in Latin? It means words, right? So a proverb is instead of using a lot of words, you're going to use a little short saying. Well, a prophet, the pro means instead, and fet means, as it says here, to speak. So instead of speaking for one, or to speak instead of another, which is one who speaks for another or a spokesperson. And kings would have prophets they would send as messengers, but in this context in which we're talking about it, it is a spokesperson who speaks for God. And this time of prophets, Samuel was considered the first prophet. He was the last judge, and then he had this transition. He served as priest, but he also served as a prophet. You'll remember he's the one who would anoint the kings, and God would use him as a messenger to go and choose the kings. Samuel began that, and it goes all the way through, and you can see it mentions a lot of them who were there: Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, that spoke to kings, as we talked about earlier. And then it says, during and after the 8th century BC, the prophets primarily geared their messages to the nation of Israel. As I said earlier, they were just public messengers preaching, often just in public places, to whomever would listen. As you can see here, and we have this in our list here, the prophet books are divided. Major prophets, there's 5 of those, and then the minor prophets. Major simply means big, or lots of words, and minor means small. So the major prophets don't mean they're more important. It simply means there's more content. They're longer books. Okay, now at the bottom of page 77, there are 2 intercessors we see in the Old Testament, 2 models. The prophet is one who is between God and people, and a priest is also between people and God, but they go in different directions. So here's the picture. You'll see this at the bottom of your page. A priest is people would do their sacrifices and all those things as they pray and do their sacrifices and acts of worship towards God, and the prophets were God speaking back to the people. So we had priests and prophets, and sometimes these jobs became mixed, but that'll help you understand kind of the basic role of priests and prophets. Top of page 78. Prophets were very unpopular. The reason is, in the nation of decay, they didn't have much good to say. You remember, this is the general message, and so they're just the corruption is in every level, from families to governmental, and so they would come say, that these things are wrong, and that's, if there's the general culture's heading in the wrong direction and you're going against the flow, you're not going to be a popular person. As it says, such preaching is unpopular in any age. And then you can see, if you look over to turn to page, the end of it, page 81. We're going to look at a timeline. I'm going to put it up here on the board behind me. I don't have my little pen to write with, but we're going to look at, okay, here's our little timeline. We have, of course, creation, 2000 BC, about 500 years later, roughly, is the Exodus. Roughly 500 years later, remember we said David, you can think 1000 BC, roughly that's David, is an easy way to remember that. And then we have Saul all the way to Solomon, that happens in the United Kingdom. Then about this time, the separation, that Solomon's son separated the kingdom. Now the kingdom goes in 2 parts. Israel, and remember Israel said, we're going to disown Judah. And so Judah is no longer even considered a part of Israel. So Israel makes its capital up in Samaria. And so these prophets, we're going to look at all of them, were prophets to the people of Israel primarily. There is some crossover a little bit. And these prophets down here were preaching to the southern kingdom, or to Judah. So now where do you find Isaiah? Anybody find him yet? Yes, he's in Judah. So he was prophesying primarily to the people in Judah. I'll put that up there, the southern kingdom of Judah. And I'm going to go, you can look back on your timeline, and 2 of his contemporaries, these are guys who lived the same time, I'll put it back up here, lived about the same time as him, and Joel and Micah are the 2 that were contemporaries with him. And we'll look, as we get to those, we'll look at all the details, but I'll put it up there, Joel and Micah. As it says, one of the best known passages in the book is Isaiah 6, 1 through 9. I'm actually going to read that quickly. It's the call, or the initial proclamation that Isaiah made. It says this: the vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah in the Jerusalem the days of, that's the kings here, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, who were all kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. This is what he told the people. He said, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, up. And so you see here there's a change in voice too, where he's speaking for God. So he's speaking in the first person. Children have I, speaking in God's first person, reared up and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. Now does that sound familiar? Right? See our theme we're talking about? They have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey knows its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. Are you starting to see why I wasn't a really popular guy? Yeah. Offspring of evildoers, that's not going to do well. Children who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged. Why will you still be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, just bruises and sores and raw wounds. They are not pressed out or bound up or softened with oil. And then it goes on to talk about desolation. City's going to be burned by fire, and it goes into that second part here, if you don't repent. So we're going to look now, as it says there, chapter 6. That's the first call. I'll switch over to chapter 6, and we're going to look at these verses one by one as it has in your book. Chapter 6. And this is in the year that King Uzziah died. I saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe was filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Now we're going to start in verse 5, which is in your book. And I said, what was his response when he saw this vision of the Lord? Woe to me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips. I am a man of unclean lips. And I dwell in the midst of people with unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And then verse 6 says, Then one seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth. And behold, touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. So we see there in verse 7. First, and then we're going to catch, this is a kind of an early picture of what we're going to see in the redemption of us. There's the first part, of course, is this confession. Woe to me, I am a sinner. And then we see this picture of putting a coal on their lips, and it's just symbolic, and it says that his sins were forgiven, his iniquity taken away, and his sin is purged or atoned for. Now that word atoned, we talked about that a little bit on Sunday. Even you didn't know it when we were talking about that cube. You know, the sacrifice of Jesus, when you see atonement, all that means is a debt has been paid. So when something's been atoned for, it's a wrong was done, and then something has been done to cover or pay for that wrong. So Jesus dying on the cross is the atonement for sins. So here we just have a picture. We're not told how the sin was atoned for, but just that his sin was atoned for. Then it continues in verse 8. Isaiah says, I heard a voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go? And you see there in your answer, this is a famous quote. What does Isaiah say there in verse 8 that's written in your book? Here am I, send me. And God said, Go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. So verse 9 is simply his call to go and speak to people. Now here you can see the parallels we talked about on Sunday, right? You've seen the parallel to even the Christian faith now, and why many people call Isaiah is actually the first gospel. We're going to look at chapter 53 in a minute, and we're going to see all the prophecies of Christ in chapter 53 and walk through it in the end of the passage. So go and tell his people. That was the first commission that was given to Isaiah. And you can see there that Isaiah, bottom page 78, came on the scene, a turning point in history of the divided kingdom. The kingdom of Judah was anxious, seeking a defense against the Assyrians. During this time, Isaiah called the people of Judah to rebirth and renewal. Remember, the Assyrians were going to completely wipe out. The northern kingdom was going to be gone. It was going to be wiped out. The Assyrians would come down. You remember that story? We're talking about the history. We're going to come down. They're going to lay siege to Jerusalem. And yet God gave Isaiah a promise. Then he told him to write this letter. You remember that? To send to the king of Assyria, that I'm going to put a hook in your nose and I'm going to turn you back where you came from. And a plague or something struck, and all these hundreds of thousands of men died. And within a few years, the entire Assyrian kingdom have collapsed. But the point is, God delivered Jerusalem from the Assyrian army. Okay, now look at top of page 79.
Give us the answer.
5. Go and tell his people. That was his commission. And as I said, we see that pattern for a recognition that you are a sinner, a confession, right? And then we see atonement for that sin. And then we see immediately, after they're atoned for, they're given a commission or something to do. That should sound familiar to some people, to us Christians, shouldn't it? That's the pattern that has happened to us as well. Okay, Isaiah 1. We're going to look at different passages here, and I'm going to read them and give you, of course, the suggested answers up here. And they speak to the basics of human nature and are applicable to every generation. You know, Isaiah, by the way, is the most quoted major prophet in the New Testament. Isaiah 1:23. I'm going to read it and I'll give you the suggested answer up here. What was it like in the day of Isaiah? 1:23, he says this: Your princes are rebels, your companions are thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause does not come to them. So in the days of Isaiah, talking about this right here, this first part, not just the religious, there's corruption everywhere, from the highest levels to the lowest levels. And then 5:20 through 23 says this: Woe to those who call evil good and call good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And there we see there that there's this culture where there's no absolute right and wrong. It goes through a list. There's excessive drinking. You can think of substance abuse. A lot of that was done for religious idol worship purposes. And of course, just the taking of bribes. And taking a bribe simply means, you know, when I lived in Asia and I told somebody, I said, well, you know, where I'm from, nobody's above the law. I don't think I'd say that anymore now that I'm a little older, but you know, that's what we say, right? But my friend in Asia looked at me like I was crazy. Like, that didn't even register with him. And where he lived, he's like, oh, I know a lot of people above the law. He said, if you have them, you know, because it's how the systems work. And so if you have a certain rank in the military, you're untouchable. If you have a certain rank in politics or in business, you know, that's the bribery. And that's what bribery is always. The wealthy, the privileged are oppressing the poor. It's always a symptom of that. Then look, Isaiah 10, what was some other things going on as that culture was becoming corrupted? It says this: Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees. That means making oppressive laws. And the writers who keep writing oppression. To turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their rights. That widows may be their spoil, that they should take advantage of widows, and that they may take the fatherless as their prey. And so that's why the Christian, Judeo-Christian, but especially in modern days, the Christian tradition, why do Christians the one started hospitals? Why? Because this is our heritage. As we don't wait on the government to come and assist people. We haven't historically. And we come to education. If you go all around the world, guess who started most of the schools in places we've been? Guess who started Princeton, Harvard, Yale? You know what all those were in the beginning? They were seminaries for training pastors, because the most educated person usually in your town, man, it might be that case, not that case anymore. What was usually the pastor. So they would send their pastors off to school because they wanted to know he's the one who would be interpreting the scriptures. And so we see here that whenever a culture sort of decays and then all of a sudden right becomes wrong in every level, and then we see it gets to the point where they're literally making laws to institutionalize oppression of the poor and of the needy. Isaiah 29:15. Other parts of this number one, this declaration, this preaching against the ills. 29:15 says this. Did I give you that one or not? Let me give you that one, sorry. Laws benefit wealthy and unfairly oppress the poor. 29:15 says this. Ah, you hide deep from the Lord your counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us, who knows us? And verse 16 continues, you turn things upside down. Should the potter be regarded as the clay, that the thing made should say of its maker, he did not make me. Okay, so what's that talking about? Can a potter say to can a clay pot made, say to its potter, you didn't make me? And of course, that's basically just saying there is no God. And so it's just a symptom of just godlessness in general that's going on. The thing that has been formed, say to him who formed it, you have not made me. Okay, now verse 31. I'll get ahead of the game here now. 31:1 says this. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, and do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. Now, what does it mean to trust in chariots as a nation? What do they mean by that? Of course, it says it up there, I guess, doesn't it? That where did they find their security? In their military treaties and their rivals, they want to say, we have the biggest, most powerful military, and our faith and our trust is not in God, it's in what? Our military might. Our military might. The book of Isaiah, as it says here, was written, and we wrote that up here, 700 years before Christ. But yet it tells a lot about the birth of Christ. Now we're going to look, and you're going to see at the bottom, page 79, this is where we'll kind of end up. We're going to look at chapter 53 in depth. But there are many, many prophecies that, remember, 700 years before Jesus is going to be born. Let's look at some of these prophecies that are answered. Chapter 7, verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name. What does it say there? Emmanuel. Now, what does Emmanuel mean? God is with us. God with us. Now, remember, that was written 700 years before Christ came. And like most of the prophecies that were given to foretell or things that would happen in the future, it seemed probably really strange. People thought, what does that even mean? That's impossible, right? That can't happen. That's never happened before. And of course, it's never happened since. Okay, let's look at the next prophecy. Isaiah 11:1 says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And that just shows that he will be a descendant. Whoops, that's already written on there. I'll back up. He's going to be a descendant of Jesse. And then Isaiah 50, verse 6. And you can go back when you get home and take your time. I'd suggest you go and highlight these. And of course, it's fascinating to go. And if you don't already have these cross-references written, if you have a study Bible, it probably already has them in the footnotes. But if you don't, you can go through and add these cross-references and write the New Testament references in here in Isaiah, and then go to the New Testament and then refer yourself back to Isaiah 56.
This is during the time of kings.
Yeah, quite a long ways after David.
So they all know who Jesse is.
Yeah, so they would all know. As a matter of fact, remember the southern kingdom of Judah, all the kings of Judah were descendants of David. The northern kingdom, Israel, it changed to several, there were 3 or 4 different families. So all the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, would have been descendants of Jesse, of David. Our 50, and what I say, verse 6, says, I will give my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out my beard. I hide not my face from disgrace and spitting. Now that people heard that, they had to think, what in the world is he talking about, right? And like a lot of those prophecies, what in the world? This is some strange stuff that is being told. All right, now 53:3. Now, if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to chapter 53. We're going to walk through. Yes, thank you. So his back and his face will be beaten, and of course it said there he'll be spit upon as well.
They surely thought this wasn't going to happen to the king. Yeah, what was this about?
And I'm going to write this up here. I should have already written it. So this is, many people call this the first gospel. It begins in chapter 52. I'm going to write this up in the corner. Chapter 52, verse 13. And then it goes through chapter 53. And this is a poem. You'll notice how it's written in lines. It's a poetry. But the entire thing, 53:12. So it's all of chapter 53, verse 12. So here we have, I think it's 4 different stanzas, and all of these stanzas are about the Messiah. We're going to read some of these. These are powerful, but it's a poem that starts at the end of 52. For some reason, they put the chapter division in the wrong spot. But a lot of these. Verse 53:3, it says, flip over to 53. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised. They esteemed him not. So he will be despised and he will be rejected. 53:5 says this, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Now this has to be strange to a Jewish person because it was illegal to do human sacrifice. That's why this page, I've read some commentaries on this. One of the reasons it's so amazing, so strange that it's here, is because it's against Mosaic law to do sacrifice, to like give a life for another person, or to do like a human sacrifice to a God. So they think, what in the world is all this talking about? So I give you that next one. He will be wounded, he will be bruised for our sins. 53:7 continues, he was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And verse 9 is not here, but I'm going to read it because it's really important. It says in verse 9, it says, and they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death. So he's going to be in the tomb of a wealthy person. Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet verse 10 says, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. Verse 11, out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many... This is atonement right here. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteousness, and he shall bear their iniquities. And then verse 12, which is the top of page 80, says this, therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered among the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. If you haven't read Isaiah 53, I'm going to do a sermon series maybe next year on this passage because it's so wonderful just to do what we're doing now and really to do it in depth and go into detail of how Isaiah 53, and you know, Isaiah had to have, I mean, this is so bizarre what he's writing. I mean, for him, that's why he had to just write this down and think, what in the world is God talking about? Because it made no connection, because remember, we're still 700 years before Christ is to come. Now, at the end of top of page 80, as we're going to close here, some interesting things. As I said, Isaiah has, first of all, how many books are in the Bible? 39 plus 27, 66. Guess how many chapters are in Isaiah? 66. That's exactly right. And of course, it's divided also into two parts. We have 39 chapters, which are kind of the first part of Isaiah's story, and then there's a 27 chapters, which is the second section of the book, where it divides time-wise. And it says, like the Old Testament, the first section, Isaiah speaks of judgment, we talked about here. And in the last part, he speaks of, see this pattern? It always comes back to, but when you eventually will return, God will restore you. And so we see that picture, that pattern, which we're going to see over and over again in the prophets. Questions or comments before we close?